I'm your host, Sean MacKenzie. Thank you for joining me once again on my channel on data analytics and data engineering. In this episode, we're going to return to our data engineering playlist, and we're going to talk about data migration between servers. And this is one of the most common things that you can do in data engineering, and being able to automate your data migration is one of the most important things that you can do. And whether it's DB2 to Oracle, or Oracle to SQL Server, or Postgres to some other database, or MySQL, or even Microsoft Access, being able to automate your data migrations is a very, very important skill. And today we're going to do our data migration from Oracle to SQL Server, and that's going to be a demonstration that'll help you with your projects. So without further ado, let's get to our data migration. Okay, so to get started, as you can see, this is an Oracle table in Oracle SQL Developer that I created, and it just has some information about some climate events. And this is a table in SQL Server in SSMS that I created, and that's going to be the destination for our climate data. And then here you can see the climate data, that it's empty and it's ready to receive some data. And then going to our Visual Studio, I'll choose a console app for .NET using .NET Framework. You could also do this in C# just as easily, using the .NET Framework and the console app. So I'll name it Oracle to SQL Server and just take the default settings there, and that's going to create me a little script that I can run as an exe in order to do our migration. And once we have our module code open, we can see that there's the sub main in there, which is the sort of main sub that runs when this little exe goes. And you can see that there's an app.config section, which allows us to put application settings and also some connection strings in. So we'll go ahead and we'll start our connection strings section so that we can put in our database connections. And we're going to add two. The first one that we'll add is our Oracle database, and so we'll say add a name is equal to Oracle DB, and then I'll just paste in our the string that I have for the Oracle database. And once that is in there, we can go ahead and we'll create the second string by using the same methodology. We'll do an add, and we'll call this one SQL Server database, and that will allow us to put our connection string in there. And make a note that you can encrypt this section of the config file so that it's safe from prying eyes. If you're interested in video to do that, how to encrypt this section, let me know and in the comments below, and perhaps I can do a video on how to encrypt the connection string section. And then we can return to our module section, and this is where we're going to do our coding. From here, one of the things that we want to add to our project here is we'll add a reference. We're going to add it to system.config, which is going to allow us to use that configuration manager, which is sort of adds quite a bit of security to our project, which is something that is desirable for these kinds of things. And once we have our system.config set to our project, then we can create our connection strings for Oracle and SQL Server. And I will make a note that it's very, very similar for using DB2 or Microsoft Access or or MySQL, any of those databases. In fact, most databases use connection strings for their ODBC configuration, and so it's very, very handy when you're going to use ODBC, and in the case of SQL Server, you can use SqlClient, and this is a nice sort of standard way of doing things, where you can have basically any kind of database so long as there's a provider for it, and that middleware is what makes the world go round in data, especially when you're talking to multiple kinds of databases. So there we go, we have our two connection strings, which is exactly what we wanted. I probably could have shortened the configuration manager part of it, but I just typed it out so that you can see everything that's working there. So we'll move on, and now what we can do is we'll create a connection string for Oracle, or we'll create a connection for Oracle, and we're going to use the ODBC.ODBC connection. Oh, I put a data adapter in there. ODBC connection, and the argument for this one, as we create a new one, is going to be to use that connection string for Oracle, and that's going to give us access to our Oracle database, so long as you do have the Oracle client or the Oracle ODBC drivers installed on your machine. And for our SQL string, we'll create str_SQL, and we'll select the fields from our Oracle table so that we can bring that data into a data set and into a data table in ADO.NET. And ADO.NET is kind of like the really cool technology that allows us to bring data in from many different databases, and it's sort of like a standard way of handling the data in our executable, so that we can do all kinds of things with it, migrate it, we can do all kinds of filtering and stuff like that. So the next thing I'm doing here is I'm just creating the data adapter, and the arguments for that are the SQL string and the Oracle connection, and that's going to allow us to connect and get the data out, and then we need a destination for that data in our executable, and that'll be a data set. And so from there, what we can do is we'll add some console.writeLine. We'll give some feedback to the user, just so that we can see our executable as it progresses. We can add some comments that come up, and so that we can see what's happening. So for this one, I'll put setup, so that we have a sort of starting, and then it'll say that it's setup, for our connections, and then I'll put one for retrieving data, just so that we know that it's connected properly if it gets to that step, and that's going to give that nice feedback, getting Oracle data, and that'll be really handy for when we're watching it execute. And then to continue our filling of our data set, we'll tell our data adapter DPT ODBC to fill a data table in our data set. And I like to always use multiple tables in one data set. Lots of people they leave the second argument blank, and they just have sort of like a default table, but a data set can have many tables, and it's quite handy to be able to have those. And then from there, the console.writeLine will say that we got our data retrieved, and now we have our data in memory in our script, or as the script runs, and we can refer to that by using a data table. So we'll say dim tbl data as data table equals dst.tables, and then we'll put in the TTMP event data in there. From there we can take a look at what we got. We can just cycle through our data table for each row in TBL data.rows. So we'll do a for next loop, and that's going to allow us to continue on and look at our data. So we can say console.writeLine, say, and then we'll just put in the say the last field. We'll look at the event description, and that'll give us some feedback. And actually, now that I think about it, it's actually not event description, it's event DESC as the last field there. So actually I'll go and change that. I just remembered that from looking at the table in the beginning, and so I should do the same in our row object, so that we're referring to that one thing. And after our sort of procedure runs, we do want to do some cleanup, so I'll create a cleanup section here, and we should probably put this into a try-catch loop, which makes it a little bit nicer if we do get some errors, that it'll just show it in the console, and that way it'll be a little bit nicer. So what I'm doing is I am using the dispose method for each of the objects that has the dispose method. You can also use the using sort of structure of doing this. This is just one way of doing it. You might want to look into that as well, which will do the disposing for you, and then I'll add my try-catch loop, or my try-catch structure there, and I can take all this code and we'll actually continue working on that inside of our try-catch. That'll make it a bit nicer in case there are some errors. And so as you can see, we have all our code here, and we can continue on. And I guess at the end of our script we'll say that we are done, and so we can do a console.writeLine. And we also don't want the script to disappear, or the executable window to disappear right away, because we want to see what happened. So we'll do a done, and then we'll say press any key to exit, and then we'll do a console.read key to just stop the console after it stops executing. So if we get an error, we also want to show that we got an error, and in this case we'll use the console.writeLine, and we'll just grab the error number and the error description. You can also get the ex.message is another way of doing it, and in this case so I'll just get error.number, and I'll put that in brackets, and if we have an error, and then I'll put error.description in the second part, so that we have something there, and then I'll also put a console.read key there, so that it stops and doesn't disappear before I can see what's happening. And I'll go up and just copy this press any key to exit, and just paste it in there, so that if we get an error, now it'll tell us the error, it'll tell us that we can press any key to exit, but then it'll stop, so that we can actually see what's happening there. And then we can test our progress so far. We can sort of test it out and just see that we got the data before we go ahead and try and put the data into SQL Server. So I'll just put a will continue here, and then I'll hit save, and then F5, and we'll just see if this builds properly and everything, and it looks like it does. And then we can see sort of what's happening there. So it looks like it's starting setup, it's getting the Oracle data, and it got the data, which is great. That's what we want to see. You can see it outputted each of the event descriptions, and then it said done. And that's exactly what we want to see here. Okay, so the data is looking good, and we can go ahead and put this in SQL Server. So we'll use some SQL Server objects with the SqlClient, just like we use the ODBC objects for the Oracle, for our connection to Oracle. And so we'll do the same thing. We'll create a connection to SQL Server, and we'll use the connection string as our argument. So it'll be SqlClient.SqlConnection, and we'll put our connection string in there. I can't remember what I called it now. Let's take a look and see. str SQL Server. So I'll copy and paste that in, and still doesn't look right. Oh, it looks like I need to put new there, and that will create our connection, a new connection to SQL Server. And just like our first example with the ODBC connection object, we'll set our SQL string. We'll reuse it this time. And I can't remember the name of the table, so I'll go back to the script that I showed you in the beginning. I called it Event Data SQL Server Table, just for clarity. And so I'll say insert into our Event Data SQL Server table, and then list our fields, data ID, event type, and event description fields, and then we'll add, we'll extend this, use the underscore, and then we'll add our values, data ID, data event type, and event description. So as you can see here, we are creating our parameters because we don't want to use dynamic SQL. We want to use a parameterized query, and so we'll have 3 parameters for that, and we'll add those parameters to our script. So because we're using an insert statement, we're going to use a command object. So we'll use an SqlClient.SqlCommand, and we'll pop our SQL string into there, and we'll pop our connection into there as the second argument, and that's going to create a nice little command that we can run over and over and over if we want to, and so we can use we can add some parameters to that, which we'll do now. So we'll say with our command object.parameters, we'll use an add. So we'll add each of our parameters separately, and we'll make sure to put the @ sign at the beginning, just like we have in our insert statement. And then we'll add the type as well. So this is where it's very, very handy doing this in ADO.NET, because you have some flexibility. We can so we'll use SQLDB type.int for integer, and for the others we'll just use nvarchars SQLDB type.nvarchar for our text fields. And so adding the last one here, this will be event description, and that'll also be an nvarchar. And I can see that the type does not match on my event type description there, so I'll go ahead and change that in the SQL string as well, just for consistency, and then we can move on. Okay, so just like we did up above here, where we looped through the rows in our data table, we'll do the same thing, except this time we're going to insert each of the rows into our target table. Now I will make a note that if you have a large number of records, it's much better to use SQL bulk copy. Please see my video on SQL bulk copy if you'd like to move, say, like 1,000,000 records or any large number of records, as doing it using a loop one by one is is more for smaller numbers of records in your migration. So we'll say for each row as data row in our TBL data.rows. We didn't actually specify as data row in our first loop, but we'll do it here. We'll set the value of each of our parameters to the values on that row, and that'll make a nice safe way of doing our insert statement using a parameterized query, as we mentioned before. So we'll use our first parameter. I've called it by 0 since it is zero-based numbering, so it'll start with 0. That'll be the data ID, and dot parameters, and then 1 dot value we'll set to the field called event type in our row object, and that one will be filled with that value. And then finally for the parameters, and it's 2 for the third parameter, dot value is equal to the row field called event description. And after that we can simply say execute our command object, which is nice and it's a nice and handy way of doing it. And so we'll say command dot execute non-query, and that will give us, it'll execute each statement and add those into our table. And SQL Server will do some connection pooling and things like that. You can look at those kinds of things. So it won't create a separate connection for every one of these insert statements. It will sort of try to make it more efficient. It's not as efficient as using SQL bulk copy if you have tons of records, but it is a good way of doing it. So just to get some feedback, I'll output on each time around. I'll say give me the data ID of the row that you just put into SQL Server, just for kicks. And there we have it. That's our loop, which we can go ahead and finish there. So we can hit F5 and see if we get any errors. So I haven't really tried this yet with the full script. And let's see what we get here. Okay, so it's starting. It gets the Oracle data, and oh, it looks like we got an error. Oh, okay, so we didn't open our connection, which is pretty important. So let's go back and we'll open our connection for our SQL Server connection. So we'll just say CNN SQL Server.open, and that'll open up our connection for that. And on a similar note, we should actually close it as well after we're done. And we can dispose of the objects as well, which we can do after here. And first we can dispose of our command object that we created, and then we can dispose of our connection as well after we've closed it, as we did above there, and that'll sort of do a little bit of cleanup of those objects. And now we've got it opening, and we've also got it closing, so that's going to help a lot for that. So let's hit F5 and see if we get any other errors, and let's see this time around. So okay, we did. Oh, I got the wrong name, so so let's double check that. Event data SQL Server table. We can check our naming, and I know that table exists in that database, so I must have put the wrong database name when I pasted in my string there. So, and I can just change that in my connection string there, because it looks like I pasted in the wrong database name in my app.config, and then we can hit F5 again, and fingers crossed, I think third time must be the charm. So let's see here. So starting getting Oracle database, perfect. There we go. So we can see the data IDs that were processed by the script, and it's gone through without any errors, and it says done. Press any key to exit, and that is exactly what we want to see here. So let's go check out our SQL Server table. So I have the script there. I'll highlight the SQL that I want to execute, and there it is. Okay, so first time around it was empty, and now that I've executed the procedure, the data has been migrated. And that's how you do data migration in ADO.NET with SQL Server and Oracle. Hope you enjoyed today's episode on how to migrate data between servers. If you like what you saw, please give the video a thumbs up, and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed yet, and click the bell when you see the bell so that you'll be notified of any new content that I put up on the channel. If you have any comments or questions about what you saw, please put those in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you might have. Have a great day, have a safe day, and I'll catch you next time.